advisor. He was the head of the treasury for England. Got in trouble, ended up in jail in the Tower for it. But that's kind of political backlash, the changing tide, so to speak. But he's also famous for giving us a new interpretation of the tools. Remember, Aristotle gave us tools, logical tools. So you have the organon of Aristotle, the different logical tools. Francis Bacon gives us the novum organum. We're going to need some new tools here, because what we're doing now is a new kind of science, and that science requires us to do induction. So instead of just deduction, deducere, going from what we already know to more stuff that we know because of what we know, instead we've got to come up with new things. And so what we've got is inductive reasoning. So I see a white swan, there's another white swan, there's another white swan, there's another white swan. I guess all swans are white, which, by the way, is wrong. In any case, that's induction. Induction has one interesting logical characteristic. It's invalid all the time. The only kind of validity you can have in logic is deductive logic. But invalid as it is, it still gives us psychological feelings of success that we figured things out. So we end up using invalid reasoning as induction in order to do a lot of science. And his novum organum especially tried to warn people about the mistakes that people typically make. Notice he was involved in Elizabeth's reign, etc. The Queen's Council, etc. James I didn't like him as much. Lord Chancellor is what his position was. Religious beliefs. If you remember, the religious upheaval in England started with King Henry VIII. King Henry VIII at first was considered by the church to be the defender of the church, because he wrote tracts against Martin Luther. And so he was hailed as a defender of the church. But when it came to him having a male heir to replace him, which he thought was absolutely essential for the stability of the court in England, and his wife Catherine of Aragon, who was his first wife, was unable to have a son, as far as he was concerned. There were some other children, but Mary, I think, was the one. But in any case, he pleaded with the Pope to have that wedding nullified so that he could marry Anne. And Anne wanted to marry him, he wanted to marry Anne, but he wanted it legitimate. She would not allow him to have sex with her unless he was married to her. And that's probably part of the issue, right? So the Pope refused to give him a divorce. And as a result, and why, by the way, did the Pope refuse to give him a divorce? Was because the Pope's forces were completely surrounded by the Spanish forces, and the Spanish forces were the forces of the father of Catherine, and he didn't want his daughter to be divorced. So that was the reason. So eventually what Henry ended up doing was getting help from Thomas More to basically, well, actually Thomas More didn't agree with him, but he ended up getting enough support from friends and changing the bishop so that he ended up having his own church So basically, he confiscated all of the church's properties and made them Church of England. Church of England instead. Didn't really have a whole bunch of theological changes. It basically stayed the same, except for the church no longer had property and that kind of power. By the way, just as an interesting aside, just this last week, the new Archbishop of England is Sarah Mullally. I don't know how you say her name, actually. I haven't heard it yet. But she was just appointed. She's not officially made the Archbishop yet, but she's the Archbishop 5 hours ago. That can't be just 5 hours ago. But so anyway, she's the new Archbishop of Canterbury. So that's kind of fun. And she's the first woman to hold that office in, I think they said 1,400 years, something like that. She was a nurse. And in fact, she became the head nurse of England for a while. That's kind of cool. Did you even know we had a head nurse of England? I didn't know that either. But so, yeah, she became ordained, etc., etc. So that's cool. But death. I didn't want to do death. I wanted to do okay. So so in science, remember he adds his novum organum. There's his so the new tools, essentially, and the experiment is part of that. We should do experimentation. I wanted to mention the idols, cult theories. Well, as you get the idea, there's lots of interesting stuff. But he talks about 4 idols that we have to be aware of. The idols of the cave. Let me see if I can do. So, 4 idols of the mind. Which idols are these? This lead us to error and false judgment. So avoid these, and that includes things like the idols of the cave, which arise from individual experiences, education, and biases. The idols of the tribe, the idols of the marketplace, and the idols of the theater. Doesn't it show that? Should be the idols of the cave, marketplace, idols of the theater. And what is the theater? By the way, the plays. It's kind of interesting because typically what the plays were performances that were done on the church steps. So the area around the front of the church was usually like a big square, so it was big enough for a crowd of people to be there. And on the steps, that's where they would have these plays, these different kinds of plays to scare people away from sinning and so on. And so in a sense, the theater seems to imply not only the idea of a play, but also the idea of the teachings of the church. So be careful of believing these church teachings might be the kind of hidden agenda under that. But it is kind of fun because those that believe that Francis Bacon was actually the author of Shakespeare. This is a theory that Shakespeare couldn't possibly have written Shakespeare. He didn't have enough education. His wife did, by the way. That's kind of interesting. And if you notice in Shakespeare's plays, the women are always the smartest ones. And clearly, Madam Shakespeare was the most educated in the house, so that's kind of interesting. But Francis Bacon is considered to be, by some, the real author of Shakespeare. And the reason he didn't actually officially announce that he was the author was because his status was too high. He couldn't write this kind of crap. It might have been fun for him, but he wouldn't want his name associated with it. So that's kind of fun. All of that, Francis Bacon, very interesting individual. By the way, the story has it that he died because he was on a coach ride with a friend during a wintry, snowy night, and he got the idea that cold might preserve meat. So he had the wagon stop at a farm. He went in and he bought a chicken from the farmer. The farmer's wife plucked the chicken, and Francis Bacon took the chicken out and stuffed snow into the chicken to see if the snow would actually help preserve the meat. Unfortunately, he caught pneumonia and died. So, interesting idea, but he died from trying it out. But back to Thomas Hobbes. Thomas Hobbes is going to travel to Europe multiple times, always because he's afraid of what's going on in England. Because even though it had become the Church of England, there were still lots of fights over what exactly that meant, and they became pietists and other religious things. They had religious wars. They ended up with a civil war. You probably heard of the war between the Roses, the white and the red, York and Corinth? Not Corinth. Corinth is in Cork. I don't remember. I have to look up history on that, War of the Roses. But in any case, Thomas Hobbes flees several times to Europe, where he becomes a fan of Father Marseille. If you remember, he's the hub that connects him to Descartes. He's also known to have visited Galileo and so on. I remember a neat thing in his writings. He was puzzled how seashells and other fossils of sea creatures could be so high up in the mountains, and he thought that was the result of the flood in the Bible. Noah describes, right? Okay. As a result of his study with mechanics, he is convinced, as Galileo is, as Descartes is, that the body is a machine. So basically, he's a determinist. Everything, even what we think, is determined by cause and effect. So when it gets to be an issue of free will, for Thomas Hobbes, we have free will as long as we're able to do what we want to do. So if I'm sitting in a chair and I want to get up and get a glass of water, I can, if I'm not tied to the chair and I have water accessible, etc. If I were tied to the chair, then I wouldn't be free to get up from the chair. So yes, there are causes and effect. I mean, the reason I wanted to get a glass of water is because I was thirsty. So there was causes and effect. In fact, it'd be silly to think cause and effect wasn't there all the time, because if there were gaps in cause and effect and I wanted to get a glass of water, I could turn on the tap, fill the glass, and the water wouldn't come out. I would decide, no, I'm not going to come out today. Wait a minute, cause and effect. Cause and effect is a requirement. I have to have that. Otherwise, it'd be ridiculous to have free will, because your free will choices wouldn't actually do anything, because you might have a gap, a causal gap, and whatever it is you wanted to do wouldn't happen. So he's a determinist, and yet at the same time a believer in free will, and his explanation for that is that they are compatible. There's no conflict between there being a cause and effect for everything, but at the same time my having free agency, and so on. But as a machine, what motivates this machine, my body, is pleasure. I want more pleasure, I want more satisfaction, and I want to avoid pain. So everything I do is geared towards that result. I want to increase my pleasure and decrease my pain. Now, this leads him into his theory of the state of nature. Let's see, state of nature. There we go. So he hypothesizes that in a state of nature, before there was government, what you would have is everybody all mechanically kind of trying to make sure that they had more pleasure and less pain. Well, the trouble is that we're completely free, and we have rights to everything. In a state of nature, everybody has rights to everything. The trouble is, you might have something that I want, and since I have the right to it, I can kill you and take whatever you have. That's perfectly fine in the state of nature, where it's a dog-eat-dog world. Everybody is fighting one another, and life is nasty, brutish, and short, right? So in this hypothetical state of nature, we end up not really doing very well, because even the strongest man can be, he has to sleep, and while he's asleep, somebody else could kill him. So he has friends, and he makes a contract with them. I'll sleep while you guard, and then when I wake up, I'll guard. And they all agree, okay, well, that'll work. So he takes a nap, and while he's sleeping, his friends kill him and take his stuff. Well, so obviously that sort of thing doesn't work, so what you need is a strong executive. An executive is the one who executes the laws. So we form a contract with more and more people, so that we give people the rights to things, but at the same time require them to do other things. So the rights and the responsibilities go together with the contract, right? And as a result of this, we keep enlarging the contract, because what we end up finding is that, well, if we're a gang, and there's other gangs, and they're all competing with us, life can still be nasty, brutish, and short. But if we keep increasing the size of the gang so that eventually we have more and more security, eventually we're at the point where we're pretty safe and we have a much nicer life. So for him, the largest gang, so to speak, would be a nation, because of course that's actually a new thing. Nations didn't used to exist, but at this time period we also see nation states beginning. And he argues that the best kind of government would be a monarch. Where does he get this? He actually gets this theory from Aristotle, who argues that you've got three different kinds of governments. You've got the monarch, you've got the group, which would be like an aristocracy, or you could have a democracy, right? And you have a good monarchy, bad monarchy. Bad monarchy would be a tyranny. You could have, different kinds of groups. So an aristocracy would be the rule of the best, so groups of the best. But there's other kinds: rule of the rich, rule of the military, rule of theocracy, and so on. So you have different groups. Typically, the British like the idea of an aristocracy, the rule of the best. But for Hobbes, a monarch, an all-powerful monarch, who, as far as he's concerned, is an enlightened monarch. And of course, Charles II will be an enlightened monarch. Why? Because Thomas Hobbes himself has been his tutor. So Charles II will be an enlightened monarch. Charles did actually do very well. His father, as you know, had his head chopped off. Thank you, Oliver Cromwell. So that was one of those deals. Kind of a neat movie, though, where Charles I, who's the one who has his head chopped off, is played by Alec Guinness. He was Pope in another movie, but he's King Charles in this one. It's kind of neat. In any case, So Thomas Hobbes argues what we do is we form a social contract. And that is where basically we've all agreed to certain rights and privileges. And as far as Hobbes is concerned, some of the rights that we have, for example, is the right to life, right to freedom. When we get to John Locke, you'll see that a third one pops in there, and that's the right to property. But keep in mind that for John Locke, property can include humans. So John Locke does argue that you can own slaves, for example. We'll talk about that when we get to John Locke. So we have rights, and these rights are what we have that we use to negotiate, and once we make our agreement, we make our social contract, the monarch is the one that's in charge and can basically decide for us. So we give up our rights, actually, in the social contract to the monarch. By the way, when we look at John Locke, we'll also look at Thomas Jefferson and point out that the connection between Jefferson and the other founders with John Locke and social contract is where we get the beginnings of our social contract theory, where we have, of course, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And that's an interesting argument in itself. But essentially, we're all motivated by our desire for happiness, and we're machine-like in that, but we do form these contracts which enable us to survive. Now, an interesting part of the Leviathan is chapter 12, and I think it's really interesting how Hobbes deals with the issue of religion. Remember, you're in a society that's in upheaval over religion. He keeps fleeing to Europe where he feels like it's dangerous. The Leviathan as a book is a support for the people to choose a monarch, right? So the monarch is the all-powerful executive. It was interesting that when Oliver Cromwell, who had become the Lord Protector of England, they offered to make him king, and he refused on the grounds that they had just overthrown a monarchy. So he was the Lord Protector officially. In reading the Leviathan, or discussing it with others, was convinced that the Leviathan meant him. So that basically Thomas Hobbes was arguing that he was the legitimate ruler because the people selected him. It wasn't a top-down church